He built his world on fear, in silence, on a name so powerful it could end careers with a single phone call. Kang Min-ho, the Golden Son, the youngest senior prosecutor Korea had ever seen, the heir to a political dynasty that had ruled from the shadows for 3 generations. But then she walked in, a black woman with curves that defied his carefully controlled world, with eyes that saw straight through every lie he'd ever told himself. She looked at him like she actually saw him. Not the prosecutor, not the heir, just him. And God help him, when she smiled. He wanted to burn it all down just to hear her laugh again. Welcome to Unfold Korean Stories. Hit that like button, share this with someone who believes in impossible love, and subscribe because you're about to witness a love story so forbidden, so dangerous, it nearly destroyed them both. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Rain pounded against the blue house windows. Min-ho stood alone in his office at midnight, staring at documents that would ruin 3 politicians by sunrise. I am 38 years old, the youngest senior prosecutor in history, the son every Korean father wished he had. His father had trained him well, too well. Power is the only currency that matters, Min-ho. Emotions? Those are for weak men who die poor and forgotten. He'd learned that lesson, carved it into his bones, built a reputation as the prosecutor who never lost, who never showed mercy, who never let anyone see beneath the surface. Tonight, though, something felt different, heavier. His phone buzzed. Another encrypted message from his father's chief of staff. The opposition party's scandal was accelerating. They needed him to make a statement, to use his authority to legitimize charges that would shift everything before the election. Politics. Always politics. He typed his response with fingers that didn't shake, face blank as stone. This was what he'd been groomed for since he could walk. This careful dance of power and perception, using the law like a weapon wrapped in silk. But as he hit send, exhaustion crashed over him like a wave he'd been holding back for years. The next morning, she walked into his life. Zuri Adeyemi, financial consultant from London, hired by the Ministry of Finance to audit government contracts. Min-ho saw her across a crowded conference room and, Jesus, dark skin glowing against a cream blouse, natural curls pulled back, professional but distracting. So distracting. She was presenting findings on construction contract irregularities, her British accent cutting through bureaucratic bullshit like a knife through butter. Sharp, fearless, brilliant. Min-ho stood near the door, officially there to observe. Actually, his father's people were terrified about what this audit might uncover. Then her eyes found him. The air shifted. Those eyes, intelligent, searching, like they could see straight through to all the parts of him he kept locked away. She held his stare for 3 seconds too long. He watched her breath catch. I watched her fingers tighten on her papers. The attraction hit him like a fist to the chest. Mutual. Immediate. Completely fucking inappropriate. She was uncovering evidence that could destroy his family. He was here to protect them. Getting involved with her would be catastrophic. And yet, after the meeting, his body moved before his brain could stop it. She was talking to her assistant in the hallway when he approached, using that calculated casualness he'd perfected years ago. Excuse me, Miss Adeyemi. I'm Senior Prosecutor Kang Min-ho. I'd like to discuss your findings. Zuri turned. Up close, she was even more devastating. Strong features. Full lips quirking into a smile that said she knew exactly why he'd really approached. Of course, Prosecutor Kang. Her voice carried a challenge. Though I suspect you already have access to all my reports through official channels. Her directness caught him completely off guard. Nobody talked to him like that. Nobody looked at him like that, like he was just a man, not a title, not a dynasty. They met for coffee that afternoon. Private room. Hotel. His security team had swept it twice. Zuri arrived exactly on time, still in that cream blouse but with her hair down now. Those curls framing her face made every rehearsed question evaporate from his mind. So they just talked. About London and Seoul. Political culture. Her work. His work. She made him laugh, actually laugh, for the first time in months. Years maybe. She was self-deprecating about her Korean language struggles, but fierce, so fierce, when defending her analysis. And there was this sadness in her eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. A vulnerability she tried to hide. He recognized it. God, did he recognize it? By sunset, he'd learned the truth. Zuri was engaged to some British banker named Richard. An arrangement more about family expectations and financial security than love. My parents died when I was young, she said quietly, stirring coffee she hadn't touched. My aunt raised me. She struggled. So when Richard came along, stable, successful, appropriate, it felt safe. But when she talked about him, no light in her eyes, no warmth in her voice. Min-ho knew that pattern. He'd lived that pattern, performing a role instead of living a life. He wanted to tell her she deserved more. But what right did he have? That night, alone in his penthouse, Min-ho poured whiskey he couldn't drink and tried to understand what the hell was happening to him. He'd had relationships before. Strategic. Appropriate. Women from political families. Connections that served purposes and ended cleanly. But this pull towards Zuri felt dangerous. Not politically dangerous, though it was that too. But dangerous in the way that mattered more. She might actually see him. The real him. Underneath all the armor. And if she saw him, if she really saw him, what if she walked away? He closed his eyes. I saw her smile. I heard her laugh. Felt that unfamiliar ache in his chest that he absolutely could not afford to feel. The next day, his father summoned him. The family estate in Gangnam sprawled like a monument to power. His father sat in the main receiving room like a king on a throne. Granite face. Cold eyes. We need to discuss the audit. Min-ho kept his expression neutral. What about it? This Adeyemi woman is becoming a problem. His father's voice was ice. Too thorough. Asking questions that lead to places we'd prefer remained undiscovered. You need to handle this. Every muscle in Min-ho's body tensed. Handle it how? His father's smile didn't reach his eyes. You're a prosecutor, Min-ho. Find irregularities in her credentials. Question her methodology. Raise doubts about her objectivity. Or if necessary. He paused. We can arrange for her contract to be terminated. She goes back to London. The audit gets reassigned to someone more understanding. The words settled in Min-ho's stomach like stones. This was what his family did. How they maintained power. He'd participated before. Helped bury investigations. Silenced critics. But the thought of doing that to Zuri, of using his position to hurt her, frighten her, made him physically ill. I'll review the situation, he said carefully. His father's gaze sharpened. This isn't complicated. She's a foreign consultant with no real standing here. Make her a problem we no longer have. A command. Clear. Direct. Disobeying would have consequences. Min-ho left that estate feeling torn in two. Duty pulled him toward protecting his family, the empire they'd built, the future he'd been raised to inherit. But something else, something new, something terrifying, pulled him toward Zuri, toward protecting her from the very machinery he was supposed to operate. That night, he made a decision that would change everything. He would protect Zuri, secretly, from the shadows, manipulating events to shield her while appearing to comply with his father's orders. Dangerous? Yes. Probably impossible? Also yes. But he couldn't bring himself to do anything else. The following week, Min-ho expanded Zuri's audit instead of terminating it. Convinced ministry officials it would demonstrate transparency. It bought her time, protection, official sanction. But he also started his own quiet investigation into those construction contracts, looking for which ones connected to his family's interests. So he could warn her away from the most dangerous discoveries. It meant long nights, reviewing documents, following money trails, uncovering truths he'd spent years avoiding. Every piece of evidence made him more aware of how deep the corruption ran, how complicit he'd been, how he'd maintained systems that enriched the powerful while bleeding everyone else dry. He saw her again at a ministry reception. Zuri wore a deep blue dress that hugged every curve. Her hair was up, elegant, leaving her neck bare. Min-ho watched from across the room as other men approached her. Smiled. Touched her arm. Leaned too close. Jealousy burned hot in his chest. He had no right to it. No claim on her. But that didn't stop him from crossing the room. "Excuse me, Miss Adeyemi. May I speak with you privately?" It was barely a question. More command than request. Zuri's eyes narrowed slightly, but she excused herself and followed him to a quiet corner. "You're very good at that," she said once they were alone. "At what?" "Making requests sound like orders. Getting exactly what you want through sheer force of presence." There was a challenge in her voice, but also something warmer, an awareness of him that made his heart race. "I apologize if I was rude." He meant it. "I saw you at Assemblyman Park. I wanted to warn you, he's not someone who should be trusted with sensitive information." "Are you warning me as a prosecutor?" Her eyebrows rose. "Or as something else?" The question hung between them, heavy. "As someone who would hate to see you get hurt," he said finally. More honest than he'd intended. Something shifted in Zuri's expression. Her professional mask slipped. "You barely know me, Prosecutor Kang. Why would my well-being matter to you?" "Because you're brave and brilliant and you don't belong in this world of political games. Because when I look at you I remember what it feels like to want something beyond power. Because you scare me in ways I don't know how to handle." He didn't say any of that. Instead, "Because I recognize someone else who's trapped by expectations they didn't choose." Her breath caught audibly. Her eyes searched his face. "We should have dinner," she said quietly, "to discuss the audit. Just the two of us." They met the next evening in Itaewon. International enough that her presence wouldn't seem unusual. Discreet enough for real conversation. Min-ho had his security team sweep the location. Monitor approaches. He told himself it was standard procedure. But he knew the truth. He needed to know she'd be safe. Zuri arrived in jeans and a soft sweater. Casual. Approachable. Dangerously touchable. They ordered food neither of them ate. Too focused on each other. She told him about growing up in London after her parents died. About the pressure to be perfect, grateful, successful. About Richard. The safe choice. The man who checked all the boxes but never made her heart race. Min-ho found himself sharing things he'd never told anyone. The weight of being the Kang heir. Watching his father destroy people. The slow erosion of whatever idealism had brought him into prosecution work. The suffocating loneliness of being powerful but never truly known. Always performing. Always maintaining the image. Zuri listened with an intensity that made him feel seen in ways that terrified and exhilarated him. When her hand reached across the table and covered his, electricity shot up his arm straight into his carefully guarded heart. "I think we're both tired of being what everyone else needs us to be," she said softly. Her words cracked something open inside him. Some dam he'd built to hold back emotions that had no place in his carefully controlled existence. They left the restaurant as Seoul's nightlife pulsed with energy. Neon lights. Wet pavement from earlier rain. Min-ho should have called his driver. Should have put Zuri in a taxi. Instead, he walked with her through crowded Hongdae streets. His security team kept discreet distance. Her shoulder occasionally brushed his arm in contact that felt more intimate than it should. They talked. Laughed. Shared street food from vendors. For a few precious hours, Min-ho forgot about political dynasties and prosecutor reputations and impossible situations. He just existed. Beside this incredible woman who made him feel alive and terrified and desperately hopeful all at once. When he finally dropped her at her hotel, their goodbye lingered in the warm night air. His hand almost reached for hers before he caught himself and pulled back. Later that night, his phone buzzed. Encrypted message from one of his father's people. "We know about the dinner. This needs to stop." Min-ho stared at the screen, anger and fear warring inside him. His family had eyes everywhere. They would have known about Zuri from day one, monitoring her movements, her contacts. Now they were making it clear his interest was noted and unwelcome. He should have felt trapped, should have recognized the smart choice was to end this. Instead, Something darker rose in his chest. More possessive. A fierce determination that they wouldn't take this from him. Wouldn't control every aspect of his existence. The next day brought the complication he'd been dreading. Zuri's audit uncovered evidence of systematic overbilling on government construction projects. Money laundered through shell companies, leading back to several prominent political families. Min-ho saw the preliminary report and recognized signatures on contracts. Names in ledgers. His father's network all over transactions funneling taxpayer money into private accounts. This was exactly what his father feared. Exposure that could topple political careers. Trigger criminal investigations. And Zuri was walking straight toward that landmine with earnest determination. Min-ho knew he had to warn her. Protect her from the backlash coming. But doing so would reveal how much he knew. How complicit he'd been. He requested an urgent meeting. Official. Ministry of Finance conference room. Miss Adeyemi, I need to speak with you about the implications of your latest findings. Zuri's expression was professional but wary. My findings are solid, Prosecutor Kang. Every transaction is documented. Every connection is verified. I understand. I'm not questioning your methodology.
He paused.
I'm trying to make you understand that exposing this level of corruption will make you enemies you're not equipped to handle. Her eyes narrowed. Are you threatening me?
No.
Firm. I'm trying to protect you. The admission hung between them.
Too honest.
Too revealing. Zuri dismissed her assistant. Waited until they were alone. Why would the prosecutor investigating these cases want to protect an auditor finding evidence? Her voice was sharp. Unless you're not really investigating. Unless you're part of what I'm uncovering. The accusation cut deep. Because it was partially true. My family is connected to some of these contracts, he said quietly. Each word tearing open his chest. Not directly, but enough that exposure will damage their political standing. I should be working to bury your findings. But I can't. He met her eyes. Because you deserve better than being sacrificed to political expediency. And because stopping you would mean becoming exactly what I've always feared I was. Zuri's expression softened. Anger gives way to something more complicated. You're asking me to walk away? He shook his head. I'm asking you to be careful. To understand the forces that will mobilize against you. And I'm offering to help you navigate those forces. To shield you from the worst of the backlash. He leaned forward. Not to bury the truth. To make sure it actually sees light instead of being buried with you. Why would you do that? Her voice was barely a whisper. What do you gain from helping me expose corruption that hurts your own family? Min-ho looked at her. Felt every defense crumbling. Because you make me want to be better than I've been. Because protecting you matters more than protecting an empire built on lies. They stared at each other across that conference table. Then Zuri did something that changed everything.
She stood.
I walked around the table and kissed him. Her lips were soft and insistent, her body pressing against his in a way that made every rational thought evaporate. Min-ho kissed her back with a hunger that shocked him. His hands found her waist, pulled her closer. Months of suppressed attraction pouring into that single contact. They broke apart, breathing hard. Foreheads touching. I'm engaged, Zuri whispered. But there was no conviction in it. And I'm the heir to a political dynasty that would destroy you without hesitation, Min-ho replied. We should stop this right now. Neither of them moved. The next few days passed in a fever dream. Stolen moments. Dangerous choices. Secret locations his security team secured. Each meeting went further than the last. Professional boundaries dissolving into heated kisses and whispered confessions. Zuri told him about Richard. About the slow death of marrying someone she didn't love. About the fear of waking up at 40 and realizing she'd wasted her one life on safety. Min-ho told her about the pressure of being his father's heir. About corruption he'd witnessed and crimes he'd ignored. About the suffocating sense that he was becoming a monster in an expensive suit. And between the words, between the confessions, they touched and kissed and fell deeper into something that felt like salvation and damnation wrapped together. But the outside world was closing in. Min-ho's father grew suspicious. The way Min-ho was protecting Zuri's audit instead of undermining it. The reports of their meetings. One evening, Min-ho was summoned to the family estate. His father waited with 3 senior advisors. Expressions carved from ice. "We need to discuss your priorities." His father's voice carried implied threat. "You seem to have forgotten who you are and what's at stake." Min-ho stood before them feeling like a child called to account, but also feeling something else. A core of steel forming where fear used to live. "I know exactly who I am," he said quietly. "I'm the prosecutor who's supposed to uphold the law, not protect criminals because they're politically connected." His father's eyes went cold. "You're my son. That comes before any position or title." The confrontation was brutal. His father laid out exactly what would happen if Min-ho continued protecting Zuri. His career systematically destroyed. Scandals manufactured to discredit him. Isolation when every political alliance turned against him. "You'll lose everything," his father said with absolute certainty. "Your position, your future, your place in this family. All for a foreign woman who'll leave Korea and forget you existed." The words should have broken Min-ho's resolve. Instead, they crystallized something forming since Zuri walked into his world. "What good is power if it requires me to destroy the only person who makes me feel human?" he said quietly. "What kind of future is worth having if it means becoming exactly like you?" The slap came fast and hard. Min-ho's head snapped sideways. The room went silent except for ringing in his ears. When he straightened and met his father's gaze, he saw fury. And something else. Desperate fear that Min-ho was choosing a path that couldn't be undone. "You're making a mistake that will cost you everything," his father said, voice tight with controlled rage. Min-ho tasted blood on his lip. "Then I'll pay that cost." He walked out knowing he couldn't go back. Knowing he'd just severed ties with the empire that defined his existence. And all he felt was relief. Like he'd been carrying impossible weight that finally dropped away. He went straight to Zuri's hotel. She opened the door, face lighting up before concern replaced joy. "What happened to your lip?" "My father happened." Min-ho stepped inside. "I told him I won't help bury your audit. That I'm choosing truth over family loyalty." Zuri's hand came up to touch his injured mouth. Gentle, grounding. "That must have cost you everything." He caught her hand, held it against his cheek. "It cost me an empire I never wanted. But it bought me the possibility of actually being worth your trust." What happened next felt inevitable, terrifying, absolutely necessary. They came together in a collision of desperate need. Hands pulling at clothes, mouths finding skin. Years of loneliness pouring into touch that felt like coming home. Min-ho had been with other women before. Careful encounters that served biological needs without touching anything deeper. But this was different. This was connection that went beyond physical to something that cracked open places in his chest he'd kept locked and frozen. Zuri's hands on his skin felt like absolution. Her whispered name like prayer. Her body against his like the answer to questions he hadn't known how to ask. They made love with an intensity born of knowing this might be all they'd ever have. That forces beyond their control were already moving to tear them apart. Afterward, they lay tangled in hotel sheets. Min-ho's hand tracing patterns on Zuri's bare shoulder. "I love you," he said into the quiet. The words felt both natural and terrifying. "I know I have no right to say that. It's too soon, too complicated. But I need you to know this isn't just attraction or rebellion. You've changed something fundamental in me." Zuri turned to face him, eyes bright with tears she refused to let fall. "I love you too." Her voice broke. But love might not be enough to survive what's coming. Min-ho kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "Then we'll make it enough. We'll find a way." The promise felt fragile against the weight of everything arrayed against them. But Min-ho meant it with every fiber of his being. The next morning brought consequences that arrived like a hurricane. Zuri's contract with the Ministry of Finance? Terminated.
Abruptly.
Budget concerns, they said. Project timelines, they claimed. But Min-ho recognized his father's handiwork in every carefully chosen word. And it got worse. Leaked stories appeared in conservative media, questioning Zuri's credentials, suggesting her audit was biased, unprofessional. The attack was coordinated, brutal, designed to discredit her work and drive her out of Korea before she could make her findings public. Min-ho tried to push back, used his prosecutor connections, but doors that had always been open suddenly closed. Allies? Suddenly unavailable. The machinery of political influence working against him with systematic efficiency. Within 48 hours, Zuri received notice that her visa status was under review. The suggestion was clear: leave voluntarily or face formal deportation proceedings that would stain her professional reputation permanently. Min-ho watched her pack with mounting desperation. His mind raced through options. Every single one led to the same impossible conclusion: his family's reach was too extensive. Their willingness to destroy opposition too absolute. He could fight them, could try to expose the corruption they were protecting. But that would take months. Years. And Zuri would be forced out long before any investigation concluded. Unless he gave them something they wanted more than revenge. The idea came at 3 a.m. Min-ho stood at his penthouse windows, staring at Seoul's skyline, and suddenly he saw it. The only path forward. His father wanted him to prioritize family loyalty. Wanted assurance that the Kang heir wouldn't betray dynasty interests for personal feelings. What if Min-ho gave him that assurance?
Publicly. Dramatically.
What if he very publicly ended his relationship with Zuri? Demonstrated that he understood his error in judgment. Recommitted to family expectations. It would buy Zuri time to leave Korea safely. To take her findings public from London, where his family's influence was limited. And it would position Min-ho to work from inside the system. Gathering evidence. Building a case that could eventually bring accountability. The plan was brutal, devastating, and probably the only way to protect Zuri while giving him any chance of ultimate success. He met with his father the next evening. Expression carefully controlled. Words chosen with surgical precision. I understand now that I allowed personal feelings to compromise my judgment. His voice was steady.
Dead.
I'm prepared to make a public statement acknowledging that mistake and reaffirming my commitment to family and prosecutorial ethics. His father studied him with cold calculation, looking for the angle, the hidden resistance. What about the woman? She'll leave Korea and return to London, where her audit findings will be reviewed by authorities with no connection to Korean political dynamics. Min-ho kept his face blank. The relationship ends completely. His father's eyes narrowed. You make the statement today, and you're seen publicly with an appropriate Korean woman within the month. Someone from an established family who understands her role. Min-ho felt something die inside his chest, but he nodded. Agreed. The press conference happened at noon the next day. Min-ho stood before a wall of cameras. Expression humble, contrite. He read from prepared remarks that tasted like ash in his mouth. I want to address recent questions about my relationship with a foreign consultant and the ways my personal judgment may have affected my professional objectivity. Upon reflection, I recognize that I allowed inappropriate feelings to develop, feelings that compromised my ability to properly evaluate evidence and maintain prosecutorial standards.
He paused.
Swallowed. I have ended that relationship and recommitted myself to serving the law and the people of Korea without personal bias. The words were perfect, sincere, the performance of a lifetime. When reporters asked about Zuri's audit findings, he deflected with bureaucratic language about ongoing reviews and appropriate channels. Professional, detached. Everything his father had trained him to be. Zuri watched from her hotel room. Min-ho's security team had sent her the live stream link with a simple message. He needs you to understand this is protection, not abandonment. But watching the man she loved deny their relationship to television cameras? Watching him describe their love as inappropriate feelings and professional compromise? It broke something inside her she hadn't known could break. She understood intellectually that this was strategy, that Min-ho was playing a political game to protect her. But emotionally, it felt like betrayal, like he'd chosen his family's empire over her, just like everyone had always warned. When her phone rang with Min-ho's number, she let it go to voicemail. When he sent messages trying to explain, she deleted them unread. Whatever he had to say, whatever justifications he'd constructed, it couldn't change the fact that he'd stood before the world and reduced what they shared to a mistake. That night, Min-ho appeared at her hotel door. Face haggard, eyes desperate. "Please let me explain. I had to give them what they wanted to protect you." Zuri stood in the doorway, arms crossed, professional mask back in place. "You protected your career and your family's political interests. That's what you were always going to do." Her voice was nice. "I was foolish to think otherwise." The words cut deeper than any blade. Min-ho reached for her hand, but she stepped back, maintaining distance. "I love you, Zuri." His voice cracked. "Everything I said today was theater designed to keep you safe while I built a real case against my father's network. Give me time to gather evidence, to do this right, and then I'll expose everything publicly." But Zuri was already shaking her head, tears finally falling. "I can't wait in uncertainty while you play political games. I can't be the secret you keep hidden while you perform for cameras and rebuild your reputation." She met his eyes. "I deserve better than being loved in shadows." She closed the door before he could respond, pressed her back against it, and sobbed for the future they wouldn't have. For the man she loved but couldn't trust. For the impossible choice between safety and her own dignity. On the other side of the door, Min-ho stood frozen, hand raised to knock again. Heart shattering with the knowledge that he'd lost her trying to save her. He'd made the practical choice. The strategic choice. The choice that protected Zuri from immediate harm while positioning him to fight the longer war. But in doing so, he'd confirmed her deepest fear. That when pressure came, he would choose power over love. And maybe she was right. Maybe he was exactly what his father had raised him to be. Someone who couldn't escape the gravity of political dynasty no matter how hard he tried. Zuri left Korea 3 days later on a British Airways flight. Her terminated contract officially listed as completed. Her audit findings submitted to international oversight bodies. Her hotel room emptied of everything except memories. Min-ho didn't go to the airport. Didn't call or text. Gave her the space she demanded even though it felt like cutting out his own heart. He told himself this was temporary. That once he'd gathered enough evidence and built an airtight case, he'd expose his father's corruption publicly. Sacrifice his position and family standing to prove that Zuri mattered more than power. But the days stretched into weeks with no contact. And Min-ho threw himself into his work with obsessive focus. He built his case like a man possessed. Following money trails. Documenting connections. Creating a web of evidence that linked his father and multiple political families to systematic corruption spanning decades. 18-hour days reviewing documents. Interviewing witnesses under pretenses that hid his true purpose. His father, satisfied by the public relationship ending, gave him more responsibility, more access, unknowingly providing the tools Min-ho needed to dismantle everything. And through it all, Min-ho felt Zuri's absence like a physical wound. Reached for his phone dozens of times wanting to call her. Before remembering that she'd asked for distance. That contacting her would put her back in his father's crosshairs. 3 months after Zuri left Korea, Min-ho finally had what he needed. Evidence so comprehensive, so thoroughly documented, that even political influence couldn't bury it. Shell companies identified. Illegal payments traced. Meetings where corruption was planned, all documented. Testimony from low-level officials willing to cooperate. Financial records showing money flowing from government contracts into private accounts. It was enough to trigger formal investigations across multiple agencies. Enough to bring down not just his father, but an entire network of political corruption. And presenting it would end Min-ho's career. Destroy his family name. Sever every connection that had defined his existence. He prepared his resignation letter as senior prosecutor. Drafted the public disclosure documents. Scheduled a press conference. Before he could second-guess the choice. This was the only way to prove he'd meant what he said. To demonstrate that Zuri mattered more than empire. The night before going public, Min-ho received an unexpected visitor. Zuri stood at his penthouse door, wearing a heavy coat against Seoul's winter cold. Her natural hair longer than he remembered, eyes carrying the same wariness that had been there when she'd closed her hotel room door months ago. "I needed to see you before tomorrow," she said quietly. Min-ho moved aside in stunned silence. She stepped inside. "I've been following your investigation from London. I know what you're planning to do." Min-ho's heart hammered against his ribs. "How did you? I may have left Korea, but I kept contacts at the ministry. People who understand what you've been building and why it matters." She pulled off her coat, revealing a simple black dress that made her look simultaneously powerful and fragile. "Are you really going to destroy your entire life to expose this corruption?" He wanted to touch her, to close the distance and pull her into his arms. But he stayed frozen, afraid that reaching for her would shatter whatever brought her back. "Yes." His voice was rough. "The evidence is irrefutable. Tomorrow I present it publicly along with my resignation and full disclosure of my family's involvement. It'll trigger criminal investigations, probably end with my father in prison." He swallowed hard. "Everything he built, everything I was raised to inherit, all of it burns." Zuri's eyes searched his face. "And you're doing this why? For revenge? For justice?" Min-ho felt emotion rising in his throat. "For you." The words came out broken. "To prove that when I said you mattered more than power, I meant it. To show you that choosing empire over love was the biggest mistake I ever made." His voice dropped to a whisper. "And I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of a second chance I know I don't deserve." Silence stretched between them, heavy with 3 months of separation and pain. Then Zuri crossed the space separating them and kissed him with a desperation that matched his own. Her hands fisted in his shirt, her body pressing against his like she was trying to merge them into a single being. "I was so angry at you," she whispered against his mouth between kisses. "So hurt, and convinced you'd chosen dynasty over everything we shared." Another kiss.
Deeper.
"But then, I watched you systematically dismantle your own family's corruption for months, building the case that would destroy them." Her voice broke. "And I realized you've been fighting for us the entire time, just in the only way that could actually win." Min-ho kissed her like a drowning man finding air, pouring months of loneliness and determination into showing her everything he felt. They made love with an intensity born of reunion and uncertainty. Clothes shed between urgent kisses, bodies remembering each other with perfect recognition. This time, there was no naivety, no illusion that love alone conquered all obstacles. They both carried scars from choices made and prices paid. But wrapped in each other's arms, Min-ho felt something settle in his chest that had been restless since Zuri left. A sense of coming home that had nothing to do with locations and everything to do with being truly known by someone who chose him anyway. When they finally lay still, hearts gradually slowing, Zuri's head on Min-ho's chest, he felt brave enough to ask the question terrifying him. "Where does this leave us when tomorrow comes and my world implodes?" Zuri lifted her head to meet his eyes. "It leaves us building something new together." She took a breath. "I've been offered a permanent position with an international financial oversight organization based in Singapore. It's far from Korea and London both. Neutral ground where neither of our pasts define us." Vulnerability crossed her features. "Come with me. Leave Seoul after you've done what needs doing. We'll start over somewhere we can just be two people who love each other instead of heirs and consultants and political complications." The offer hung in the air, precious and terrifying. Min-ho had never seriously considered leaving Korea, had assumed his entire life would play out within Seoul's political theaters. But the thought of walking away from destroyed empire into uncertain future with Zuri, it felt like the first real choice he'd ever made. The press conference the next morning drew every major media outlet in Korea. Shocking corruption revelations bringing cameras and reporters in overwhelming numbers. Min-ho stood at the podium, wearing a simple dark suit instead of his usual prosecutor regalia. The evidence files stacked beside him like weapons. "Good morning." His voice was steady.
Clear.
Today I'm announcing my resignation as senior prosecutor and presenting comprehensive evidence of systematic corruption involving high-ranking political families, including my own. For the next 90 minutes, he methodically documented every crime he'd uncovered, named names, showed receipts, burned down his father's empire with cold precision. He saw his father in the audience, saw the moment understanding and fury crossed those cold features, saw security teams moving to intercept, knowing they were already too late. When Min-ho finished his presentation, chaos erupted. Reporters shouted questions. Officials scrambled to respond. His father's allies began immediate damage control that couldn't contain the wildfire. Min-ho walked away from the podium and out of the building. His security team formed a protective barrier against the media surge. Zuri waited in a car that would take them to the airport. He'd already packed a single bag, already arranged for investigative authorities to have full access to his evidence. There was nothing left in Seoul except the smoking ruins of a dynasty he'd deliberately destroyed. As the car pulled away from the prosecutor's office for the last time, Min-ho felt something unexpected. Not regret or fear, but profound relief at finally being free. The news cycle exploded over the following days and weeks. Formal investigations launched, arrests made, political careers ended in spectacular fashion. Min-ho's father was indicted on multiple corruption charges, assets frozen, political network collapsing as former allies scrambled to save themselves. The Kang dynasty that had dominated Korean politics for 3 generations crumbled under the weight of evidence its own heir had compiled. And through it all, Min-ho was in Singapore with Zuri, watching from a safe distance, providing testimony when requested, but otherwise building a new life far from the wreckage. They rented a small apartment overlooking the harbor. Nothing like the penthouse luxury Min-ho had known, but somehow more valuable for being chosen rather than inherited. Adjusting to normal life proved harder than Min-ho expected.
He had no job,
No status, no identity beyond his relationship with Zuri and the growing infamy of being the prosecutor who destroyed his own family. Some days the weight of what he'd sacrificed pressed down on him, made him question whether love really was worth the empire. But then Zuri would come home from her oversight work, would tell him about international corruption cases she was helping investigate, would look at him with eyes that held no judgment or expectation, just steady affection. And Min-ho would remember why he'd made every choice, would feel grateful for the chance to be someone other than the person his father had tried to create. 6 months into their Singapore life, Zuri came home with news that changed everything again. She carried a positive pregnancy test and an expression mixing joy with uncertainty. The revelation hit Min-ho like lightning, terror and wonder colliding in his chest. A child meant permanence, meant they were truly building a future together, meant responsibility that couldn't be undone. But looking at Zuri's face, seeing hope and fear and love all tangled together, Min-ho felt something settle inside him that had been unsettled since birth. This child would grow up free from dynasty pressure and political expectation, would be raised by parents who chose love over power and each other over empire. He pulled Zuri into his arms and kissed her with all the gratitude and determination he felt. "We're going to do this right," he promised. "Our child will know they're wanted for who they are, not what they represent. We'll never be a chess piece in political games or a tool for family advancement." Zuri smiled against his lips, her hands cradling his face. "Then we're already succeeding, because we're choosing differently than we were raised." They married in a simple ceremony at Singapore's City Hall. Just the two of them and 2 witnesses pulled from the street. No family, no political connections, no media coverage. Min-ho wore an off-the-rack suit. Zuri wore a cream dress she'd bought that morning. And when they said their vows, it felt more real than any grand political wedding could have been. They promised to choose each other daily, to build family on a foundation of honesty rather than obligation, to teach their children that integrity mattered more than influence. Standing before a civil official in a government building half a world away from Seoul, Min-ho felt more powerful than he ever had as prosecutor or heir. This was the empire that mattered. This small family he was building with the woman he loved. These choices that served connection rather than control. 8 months later, Min-ho held his daughter for the first time. Her tiny face scrunched and perfect. Her grip on his finger stronger than seemed possible for something so small. They named her Jimin. Beautiful truth. After everything they'd fought to protect and honor. Looking at his daughter, Min-ho understood finally why his father had been willing to do terrible things to protect dynasty and power. But where his father had chosen empire over ethics, Min-ho chose the opposite path. Determined that his daughter would inherit truth rather than corruption. Freedom rather than obligation. It wasn't easier or safer or more comfortable than the life he'd left behind. But watching Zuri nurse their daughter in their small Singapore apartment, Min-ho knew he'd made the right choice. Had finally become someone worth the love he'd been given. 2 years passed in rhythm of ordinary joys and challenges. Min-ho found work as a compliance consultant for international firms, using his prosecutor experience to help companies navigate anti-corruption regulations. It wasn't glamorous or powerful, but it was honest work that let him sleep without nightmares of compromised integrity. Zuri thrived in her oversight position, traveling for investigations while Min-ho managed childcare and discovered unexpected talent for domestic life. They built a friend network among other expatriates, attended birthday parties and neighborhood gatherings, lived lives defined by small moments rather than political headlines. And slowly, Min-ho's nightmares about his father and destroyed dynasty faded, replaced by dreams of his daughter's future and the family they were nurturing together. News from Korea came in occasional waves. His father served 2 years in prison before being released on medical grounds. Health broken by incarceration and public disgrace. The family estate was seized and sold. Assets distributed to victims of the corruption schemes Min-ho had exposed. Former political allies who'd survived the scandal? They distanced themselves from the Kang name, erasing 3 generations of influence as though it had never existed. Min-ho felt a strange mixture of grief and relief reading these updates. Mourning the loss of a father he'd never really had while grateful the cycle of corruption had finally ended. When his father died 18 months after release, Min-ho didn't return to Korea for the funeral. He sent simple flowers and brief condolence to distant relatives he barely knew. That chapter was closed. Those ties permanently severed. But the past never fully releases its grip. On a humid Singapore evening when Jimin was 3 years old, Min-ho received an unexpected email. A Korean journalist writing a book about political corruption and the prosecutor who'd exposed his own family. The journalist wanted an interview. Wanted Min-ho's perspective on choices made and prices paid. Reading the email, Min-ho felt old anxieties stir. Fear of attention and scrutiny. Worry that reopening those wounds would damage the peace he'd built. But Zuri, reading over his shoulder, had a different reaction. "Maybe it's time to own your story completely," she said gently. Not as scandal or tragedy, but as an example of choosing integrity when it cost everything.
She squeezed his hand.
Show others that different choices are possible. Her words settled something Min-ho hadn't known was unsettled. Permission to acknowledge his past without being defined by it. He agreed to the interview on condition of anonymity for his family. Protection for Zuri and Jimin from association with his choices. The journalist agreed. They met in a Singapore cafe, while rain drummed against windows. Min-ho talked for hours about dynasty and corruption. About falling in love with a woman who made him want to be better. About the impossible decision to destroy everything he'd been raised to protect. Telling the story from the distance of years and continents, Min-ho saw patterns he'd missed while living through it. Recognized ways his father's training had shaped reactions even when rebelling against that training. Understood that becoming a different person required not just a single brave choice but daily commitment to different values. Different priorities. Different definition of success. The journalist recorded it all. Asked thoughtful questions that pushed Min-ho to examine his choices with clearer honesty. When the book published 6 months later, it became an unexpected bestseller in Korea, sparking national conversation about political corruption and the courage required to expose it. Min-ho's anonymity held. but friends and colleagues who read it recognized pieces of his story. Connected he'd thought well hidden. Some responded with admiration for choices he'd made. Others with judgment for betraying family loyalty. Min-ho found he cared less about outside opinions than he would have years ago. His sense of self no longer depended on public approval or political standing. What mattered was Zuri's hand in his. Jimin's laughter filling their apartment. The quiet satisfaction of work that aligned with his values. He'd traded empire for integrity, and every day that trade felt more worth the cost. 5 years after leaving Korea, Min-ho and Zuri took Jimin on her first visit back to Seoul. Wanting their daughter to know something of her Korean heritage, even if she'd never be part of the dynasty Min-ho had destroyed. They visited palaces and museums, ate street food in Myeongdong, walked along the Han River while Min-ho pointed out landmarks of his former life. It felt strange being back, like visiting a place he'd once lived in dreams rather than reality. The prosecutor's office looked smaller than he remembered. The family estate's location now occupied by a modern apartment building. Physical spaces had moved on without him, the city adapting and changing in ways that made his absence unremarkable. On their final evening in Seoul, Min-ho took Zuri to the hotel where they'd first made love. The room where he'd felt his carefully controlled world crack open with possibility. They stood on the balcony overlooking the city's nighttime glow. Jimin asleep in the bedroom behind them. Min-ho felt grateful weight of how far they'd come. "Do you ever regret it?" Zuri asked quietly, her hand in his. "Giving up everything you were raised to inherit?" Min-ho thought about the question seriously, examined his life honestly. "I regret hurting my father, even though our relationship was broken long before I exposed his corruption. I regret that Jimin will never know her grandfather or have connection to Kang family history." He squeezed her hand. "But I don't regret choosing you. Choosing integrity. Choosing to be someone my daughter can be proud of without qualification or caveat." He met her eyes. "Empire was never worth keeping if the price was my humanity." Zuri kissed him softly, her free hand resting over his heart. "You gave me something I never expected to find. Permission to believe that choosing love over obligation wasn't weakness, but the bravest thing possible." Min-ho held her close, breathing in her scent, feeling her warmth, grateful for the impossible journey that brought them here. They'd both been trapped by expectations and fear, both convinced they had to sacrifice their hearts to maintain security or family approval. But somehow they'd found each other at exactly the moment they needed permission to choose differently. And that choice, repeated daily for 5 years, had built a life neither could have imagined, but both cherished with fierce gratitude. Flying back to Singapore the next day, Min-ho looked down at Seoul's sprawling landscape disappearing beneath clouds. Felt no longing to return permanently. No regret for the life he'd left behind. His home was wherever Zuri and Jimin were. In the small apartment with creaky floors and too little storage. In the ordinary routines of school runs and grocery shopping. In the quiet moments of being fully present with people he loved completely. The Korean Mafia boss. The prosecutor heir. The political dynasty. All of it had been necessary chapters in becoming who he was now. But those chapters were closed. Their lessons learned and integrated. The story continuing to unfold was sweeter and simpler than anything power could have provided. That night in Singapore, tucking Jimin into bed, Min-ho told his daughter a story. About a prince who lived in a castle made of gold but felt empty inside until he met a wise woman who taught him that real treasure was choosing truth over comfort, love over power, connection over control. Jimin listened with wide eyes, asking questions about the prince's choices, whether he was happy in the end. "Yes," Min-ho said softly, kissing her forehead. He was happy because he learned that the best empire to build is a family where everyone feels safe and loved and free to be themselves. Jimin smiled sleepily. "Like us, Appa." "Like us," Min-ho agreed, his heart full to bursting. Standing in the doorway watching his daughter drift into sleep, Zuri's arm around his waist, Min-ho felt profound peace settle over him. The Korean prosecutor had lost his empire, his status, his family name. Every source of power he'd been raised to value. But that loss had created space for something infinitely more valuable. A life built on love and integrity. A family created through conscious choice rather than dynastic obligation. A future defined by hope rather than fear. He'd been terrified that first night with Zuri. Afraid of the way she made him feel. Of the vulnerability her presence demanded. But embracing that terror, choosing her despite the cost, had been the bravest and best decision he'd ever made. And listen, if this story hit you right in the feels, don't keep it to yourself. Smash that subscribe button because Unfold Korean Stories brings you these emotional roller coasters every single week. Stories about impossible love, second chances, the courage it takes to choose hope over fear. Stories about real people making impossible choices. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from everything you know for the one person who makes you feel alive. Don't miss out on the next one. It might be exactly what your heart needs to hear. Until next time, remember, every ending is really just a new beginning waiting to unfold.